In November 1944, a thunderous series of explosions rocked the frozen fjords of Norway. The German battleship Tirpitz, a 52,000-ton giant, was finally under attack by the full might of the Royal Air Force. This battleship had long been the scourge of Allied Arctic convoys and a lurking threat in the North Atlantic. After numerous failed attempts to destroy her, the Allies launched one final daring air raid to sink the Tirpitz once and for all. In a matter of minutes, the pride of Hitler's navy was crippled and capsized, ending a dramatic chapter of naval warfare. This is the Tirpitz wartime saga, from the fear she instilled, through the attacks she endured, to the fateful mission that sealed her fate. Built as the sister ship to the infamous Bismarck, Tirpitz was launched on April 1st, 1939, at the Kriegsmarinewerft Wilhelmshaven shipyard. With a length of 251 meters, or 823 feet, a beam of 36 meters, or 118 feet, and displacing over 52,000 tons fully loaded, she was among the largest battleships ever constructed by a European navy. Tirpitz was powered by 3 massive geared steam turbine engines, fed by 12 high-pressure boilers, generating a total of 163,000 shaft horsepower. This immense power drove her 3 propellers, allowing the battleship to reach a top speed of over 30 knots, a remarkable pace for a ship of her immense size and weight. At cruising speed, she had an operational range exceeding 8,800 nautical miles, making her a global threat capable of striking Allied shipping lanes far from German waters. Her armour and armament were equally impressive. Tirpitz carried 8 massive 15-inch 380mm guns in 4 dual-gun turrets, designed to penetrate enemy battleship armour at extreme ranges. These main guns could hurl 800-kilogram shells nearly 22 miles with lethal accuracy. To fend off smaller vessels, Tirpitz bristled with 12 150mm secondary guns and 16 105mm anti-aircraft cannons, later bolstered by additional 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons as air threats intensified during the war. For defence, Tirpitz was clad in thick layers of Krupp steel armour, with her main armour belt measuring up to 320mm thick, complemented by reinforced armoured decks and bulkheads designed to withstand heavy shelling and aerial bombs. Despite this impressive armour and firepower, the very complexity of her design contributed to vulnerabilities. Her massive size made her a tempting target, and as the war progressed, it became increasingly clear that her greatest threat came not from rival battleships, but from relentless and innovative aerial attacks, something her designers had underestimated. With these specifications in mind, it's clear why the Allies devoted immense resources and risked numerous operations to neutralize Tirpitz, a warship whose sheer presence dictated strategic decisions and whose eventual destruction marked a turning point in naval warfare. In early 1942, Hitler moved Tirpitz to occupied Norway to dominate the Arctic seas. From hidden fjord anchorages, this heavily armed battleship could pounce on Allied convoys carrying crucial supplies to the Soviet Union, or even break out into the Atlantic shipping lanes. Her role was as much psychological as tactical. Simply by being in Norway, Tirpitz acted as a fleet in being, tying down Allied naval forces that had to remain on guard. The Royal Navy was compelled to keep multiple heavy ships, never fewer than 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier, plus escorts, on standby to counter a possible Tirpitz sortie. Winston Churchill considered Tirpitz the primary threat to Allied shipping and made her destruction a top priority. He famously remarked that neutralizing Tirpitz would alter the entire naval situation throughout the world, underscoring how this single warship cast a long shadow over the war at sea. Tirpitz's mere presence had deadly effects, even without engaging the enemy directly. In July 1942, Allied convoy PQ-17, bound for Russia, was ordered to scatter upon reports that Tirpitz might be approaching. The result was disastrous. Undefended merchant ships were picked off by U-boats and aircraft, and by the end of the ordeal, 12 ships were sunk. All this happened without Tirpitz ever being present, still at its moorings in Altenfjord. Such events cemented the battleship's fearsome reputation. The German Navy kept Tirpitz tucked away in fortified Norwegian fjords, where tall mountains, fog banks, and smoke screens made her a difficult target. She was nicknamed the Lonely Queen of the North, rarely venturing out, yet looming large in Allied plans. By late 1943, Tirpitz had only fired her guns in anger a couple of times, once bombarding a remote Allied outpost on Svalbard, but the Allies could not ignore the strategic threat she posed. From 1942 onward, the British and their allies undertook an extraordinary campaign, arguably the most numerous and varied succession of attacks ever aimed at a single ship. These efforts played out like a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game in the fjords of Norway. A brief timeline of the major attempts illustrates the tenacity of the attackers and the resilience of the target. September 1943, Operation Source. In a covert raid, British Royal Navy crews piloted tiny X-class midget submarines into Altenfjord and Kofjord, where Tirpitz was anchored. Dodging nets and patrols, they snuck beneath the battleship and planted huge 2-ton explosive charges. The blasts tore a large 18-meter gash in Tirpitz's hull and flooded her, causing severe damage. Tirpitz was crippled, one of her main turrets was thrown off its bearings, and she was out of action for 6 months. Operation Tungsten. As soon as Tirpitz was repairable, the British struck again. On the 3rd of April 1944, waves of carrier-based Fairey Barracuda dive bombers, launched from Royal Navy carriers like HMS Victorious, surprised Tirpitz at anchor. They scored 15 direct hits with armor-piercing bombs, smashing the ship's superstructure. Although the 15-inch thick deck armor deflected most of the blast, the raid killed over 120 crew and injured some 300, including the ship's commander, Hans Meyer. 2 of Tirpitz's secondary gun turrets were destroyed, and fires broke out across the vessel. She survived, but needed weeks of repairs and firefighting. July and August 1944, Operations Mascot and Goodwood. The Royal Navy launched several follow-up airstrikes over the summer of 1944. Operation Mascot in July and a series of raids under Operation Goodwood in late August saw fleet carriers send dozens of bombers against Tirpitz. However, these raids achieved little. The Germans blanketed Tirpitz in artificial fog and smoke, and most attacking aircraft could not even spot the ship. Some bombs fell close, causing minor splinter damage, but no decisive hits were scored. After Goodwood in August 1944 failed to sink or seriously cripple the battleship, the Royal Navy reluctantly concluded that further carrier attacks were unlikely to succeed. The task of finishing off the Beast was handed over to the RAF's heavy bombers. September 1944, Operation Paravane. With Tirpitz still lurking, the RAF's elite No. 9 and No. 617 squadrons, famous as the Dambusters, were equipped with a new secret weapon, the Tallboy bomb. This 12,000-pound earthquake bomb had been designed by engineer Barnes Wallis to penetrate hardened targets with devastating effect. On the 15th of September 1944, 27 RAF Avro Lancaster bombers flew a long-distance mission from a base in northern Russia to attack Tirpitz's fjord haven. Braving flak, one Lancaster managed to hit Tirpitz with a Tallboy. The gigantic bomb pierced the ship and blew a massive hole in her bow, wrecking her forward compartments. This single hit caused extensive damage. Tirpitz was flooded and rendered unfit for combat. Though still afloat, she could no longer steam at sea. To prevent further harm, and with Soviet forces advancing nearby, the Germans hastily moved Tirpitz to a new anchorage near Tromsø in northern Norway. There she would serve as a stationary coastal defense battery, and, they hoped, remain in shallow enough water to avoid sinking if hit again. October 1944, Operation Obviate. The RAF tried once more on the 29th of October 1944 to finish the battleship. Dozens of Lancasters flew from Britain to Tromsø, skirting neutral Sweden to approach from an unexpected direction. However, nature intervened. Clouds obscured Tirpitz at the critical moment. The bombers dropped their tallboys blind. All missed. A single near miss caused slight additional damage, but nothing of note. With winter approaching and daylight dwindling in the Arctic, the RAF knew they had to act quickly for another chance. Despite these setbacks, the noose was tightening around Tirpitz. She was badly hurt, stuck in Tromsø, and Germany's resources were dwindling. By late 1944, Tirpitz had become as much a liability as an asset for the Germans. But she was still a formidable fortress that would require one last massive blow to destroy. By early November 1944, Allied intelligence confirmed that Tirpitz remained operational enough to be dangerous if left alone. The RAF planned one final all-out attack before Arctic winter darkness set in. Codenamed Operation Catechism, the mission essentially reused the previous plan, timing, and approach of the October attempt. However, this time, fate would favour the attackers. The plan called for a force of RAF Bomber Command Lancasters to fly from bases in northern Scotland, sneak over German-occupied Norway, and strike Tirpitz at anchor near Tromsø in broad daylight. Weather was the critical factor. Heavy cloud had foiled past raids. After several postponements due to storms, a forecast of clear skies gave the green light for the 12th of November. In total, 32 Avro Lancaster bombers were dispatched for the raid, each armed with a single tallboy bomb in its modified bomb bay, plus one Lancaster carrying film cameras to record the attack. The crews were the RAF's best, veterans of many raids. They knew this mission could finally bring down their elusive target. The Germans, for their part, had reinforced Tirpitz's defences as best they could. They surrounded her with anti-aircraft batteries on land and 2 flak ships moored nearby. They also installed anti-torpedo nets around the hull, and even began dredging the anchorage to make it shallower, hoping if she was hit again, she might settle on the seabed rather than capsize. However, time and resources were short. Crucially, the smokescreen generators were not yet operational at Tromsø. Only a few improvised smoke pots on small boats were available. And the Luftwaffe fighter cover was in disarray. A group of interceptors had been moved to a nearby airfield, but the pilots were inexperienced and unprepared for a sudden attack. In fact, the German fighter's commander, Major Heinrich Erler, was away conducting training on the morning of the raid, and no effective fighter defense launched in time. In the pre-dawn hours of November 12, 1944, the Lancasters roared off their runways in Scotland one by one, assembling over the North Sea in radio silence. Flying at low altitude to avoid radar, they crossed the Norwegian coast through a known gap in German radar coverage. Once over neutral Sweden, the bombers rendezvoused at the frozen Lake Tornetrask, a daring violation of Swedish airspace that gave them a direct path to the target from the southeast. As sunrise approached, the force climbed to bombing altitude, around 14,000 to 15,000 feet. The operation leader, Wing Commander James Willie Tate of 617 Squadron, fired a flare to signal the final turn toward Tromsø. At 9:35 a.m., the Lancasters spotted Tirpitz below, gleaming in the morning light off Håkøya Island. The element of surprise was achieved. No smokescreen covered the ship. Caught in the open, Tirpitz's crew sounded the alarm, and all hell broke loose. Flak guns on the ship and surrounding shore batteries began pumping bursts of black smoke into the sky. In a desperate bid, Tirpitz even fired her main 15-inch guns straight up, roaring in anger one last time, using special timed fuse fragmentation meant to burst in the air as giant anti-aircraft rounds. However, these huge shells could not reach the altitude of the high-flying Lancasters and fell harmlessly into the fjord. Nothing now could stop the bombers' approach. With calm determination, the RAF pilots lined up on the target. The attack formation came in gaggles of 4 to 6 bombers, each group aiming for a different release point to bracket the battleship. At approximately 9:41 a.m., Wing Commander Tate's Lancaster was among the first to drop its tallboy. One after another, the 12,000-pound bombs fell, hurtling down at near supersonic speed. Within moments, enormous geysers and fireballs erupted around the Tirpitz. One tall boy struck just forward of the massive gun turret, gouging into the armoured deck. But this bomb turned out to be a dud and did not explode. Another tall boy, dropped by Tate's own aircraft, hit amidships on the port side near the ship's aircraft catapult. This one detonated deep inside the hull, right above the port side boiler and engine rooms, with cataclysmic effect. A third bomb likely struck near the stern. It either ricocheted off the water into the ship, or penetrated close to the rear turret, exploding near the aft ammunition magazines and starting a furious fire. Almost all the other tall boys were near misses, but even those were devastating. The massive shockwaves from near misses ripped open seams in the hull below the waterline. As the last bomber released its payload by 9:49 AM, direct hits and explosions had engulfed Tirpitz in smoke and flame. The entire port side of the battleship was shredded and ruptured by bomb strikes and the concussive force of near misses. Within minutes, this damage sealed Tirpitz's fate. The battleship began listing heavily to port as her portside compartments flooded. On board, chaos and terror took hold. Surviving crew scrambled to escape or take cover as the decks tilted beneath their feet. Just 10 minutes after the first bomb hit, Tirpitz's list had grown so severe that she rolled over. At 9:52 AM, the mighty battleship capsized violently to port, her massive hull turning turtle and settling upside down in the shallow fjord. Inside, hundreds of sailors were trapped as compartments inverted and water rushed in. Ammunition began to cook off, sending internal blasts through the upturned hull. In that brief span, Norway's Lonely Queen was vanquished. A cheer went up in some of the Lancaster bombers. They could see the great ship belly up in the water, her hull visible and air bubbling out as she died. The RAF had finally done it. With fuel running low, the bombers turned for home. It was a clean success for the RAF, achieved with no Allied casualties. In the cold waters off Tromsø, Tirpitz's hull now lay partly submerged, a huge iron tomb for much of her crew. Out of a crew of roughly 1,700 on board that morning, between 950 and 1,200 men were killed in the final attack. Many perished instantly in the explosions. Many others went down with the ship as she capsized. Rescue efforts by German forces and local Norwegians saved around 200 survivors from the frigid sea. Dozens more were trapped alive inside the overturned hull, hammering on the steel. A few were rescued by cutting through the bottom, now topside, of the ship, but most could not be reached in time. The disaster was so swift and overwhelming that it prompted courts-martial in Germany. Officials sought to blame someone for the loss. Several German officers, including the Air Defense Commander, Major Erler, were accused of dereliction of duty, as the fighters hadn't scrambled and Tirpitz was caught without a smokescreen. However, by that point in 1944, such finger-pointing did little to change the outcome. The sinking of Tirpitz was welcomed with relief by the Allies. In Britain and the Allied press, headlines celebrated, and Norway, which had suffered under German occupation, quietly rejoiced. Churchill himself felt vindicated that his long-sought goal was accomplished. The great menace in the north had been eliminated. Strategically, Tirpitz's destruction tilted the naval balance decisively in favour of the Allies in European waters more than it already was. No German capital ship remained to threaten Allied convoys or tie down Allied fleets. The Kriegsmarine's last big battleship was gone, following the Bismarck, sunk in 1941, and Scharnhorst, sunk in 1943. This allowed the Royal Navy to reallocate forces. For instance, British battleships and carriers could be sent to the Pacific Theatre or other duties, rather than waiting in home waters for Tirpitz. As one Royal Navy report noted, with Tirpitz out of the way, Arctic convoys to Russia could sail with far less risk, and the overall naval situation in the North Atlantic improved dramatically. For the people of occupied Norway, Tirpitz's demise also had symbolic importance. the wreck of the battleship remained a massive presence in Tromsø Fjord. In the months after the sinking, the upturned hull was visible from miles away, a grim monument to war. After Germany's surrender in 1945, large-scale salvage operations began. Over the next decade, the wreck was cut apart and scrapped for metal, a process that continued into the 1950s. The saga of the Tirpitz, from her emergence as a formidable threat, through countless operations to sink her, to the final successful strike, reads like a fictional wartime epic. This lone battleship forced the Allies to divert enormous resources and inspired some of the most innovative attacks of World War II. Her sinking in Operation Catechism was a testament to Allied persistence and ingenuity. It removed the beast of the North from the chessboard of war, ensuring that the vital supply lines on the seas would remain secure. In the end, the Tirpitz met a fate as dramatic as her life, marking the end of an era of battleship warfare in Europe. The Allied airmen and sailors who committed themselves to Tirpitz's destruction had finally prevailed, and the naval balance in Europe swung permanently in their favour with the fall of Nazi Germany's last great warship.